everybody. Welcome back to episode 24 of the Progressive Democrats of Howard County podcast. I am your co-host, Jake Burdett, joined by my other co-host, Hiri Hagdu. How you doing today, Hiri?
Hey, Jake. Everybody. It's good to be with you today, Jake, on episode 24. Man, we're cruising with these podcasts. So it's good to be it's good to be here today.
Yeah, we're almost at the quarter of a century mark there. So looking forward to episode 25. And we have a very timely episode this month. We are joined by guest Dedrick Asante-Muhammad, who is the Chief of Organizing, Policy, and Equity at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. And Dedrick, he's going to tell you a little bit more about himself and about his study that just came out, but with his nonprofit that he works for, they just put out a study called Columbia at 55, Creeping Segregation and Lack of Affordable Housing Threatens a Legacy of Black-White Integration. So Dedrick, thank you for joining us today. You want to just tell the audience a little bit about yourself and sort of why you were interested in doing a study like this?
Sure. I was raised in Colombia from like almost 1 year old. So and it was my father's African American, mother's white, and they definitely came here because of Colombia's openness to interracial couples, Black and white couples. I think the first child born in Colombia had a Black dad and white mom, or vice versa, or something like that. Actually, someone connected me to him, and actually I talked to him online when I was Facebooking about when I figured that out. And so I've always understood this kind of dynamic of racial equity. I always appreciated Colombia's kind of planned community, the idea of single family homes next to apartments, next to townhomes, and supposed to have shared space. Myself, when my parents divorced, we kind of went from strongly middle class to lower income, qualifying for welfare and what have you. And so when we didn't have much money, I really did appreciate, being able to stay in the same school and the public spaces and be able to kind of, still get to enjoy aspects of Colombia even without funds. So I thought that was, interesting and progressive, and always was interested in studying it. I was very into racial, socioeconomic justice. I went on to work in multicultural centers, went on to work for Reverend Al Sharpton, went on to focus on studying the racial wealth divide for the last 20 years through different organizations, think tanks, Institute for Policy Studies, NAACP, and now the National Community Reinvestment Coalition that does community economic development work. So when I had this opportunity, and a co-author, Bruce Mitchell, who's one of our lead researchers, who actually grew up in Howard County and more saw how Howard County changed as Columbia grew, we were like, okay, let's, we didn't have any funding or anything, but we said, let's do this, let's explore it outside of our memories. And Columbia history, went to Oakland Mills High School, some Columbia celebrities. I went to high school with Aaron Magruder, who went on to write the Boondocks, and that was cool. And one of my best friends was Jason Siddick, and his older brother, David Siddick, was part of a pretty popular rock band called TV on the Radio that was pretty big in the late 90s or what have you. So those are the Columbia celebrities I knew growing up in Columbia.
Yeah, Dedrick. So first of all, it's good to have you on our podcast. We just to recount, we met in the context of running for Central Committee a few months ago, and we introduced the different Central Committee candidates, and when you spoke there, it was really good to hear that someone with your background of working in civil rights and working in for economic justice was willing to run for Central Committee and be active outside of the context of what, the establishment, it felt like, we had reinforcement. So it was, it was really good that you were part of that team. And I really appreciated a lot of the points that were made in terms of, first of all, the data that that it brought to bear. For example, what metric to use for housing affordability, and so on and so forth. So those are all very good. And just to dive in right away to questions, if you had to, so what would be the one point you would hope that the reader of the research and the report, what would be what would you want the main takeaway to be?
Yeah, and I think, there's many different levels, I think, of this report, right? So it's kind of a big takeaway. There's, things you get much more in detail about. And for myself, and I think Bruce, we both felt this was our first attempt at analyzing. And like, I think when you first go into an area and you do a report, you realize by the time you're done, oh, now I'm really ready to go in and go deeper, right? So there's clearly like 4 more reports we should be doing. I'm not saying we're going to, because again, this was kind of an unfunded fund project, but there's a lot of things I want to further explore. But, we titled the report, Columbia at 55, Creeping Segregation and Lack of Affordable Housing Threatens a Legacy of Black-White Integration, right? And so that kind of points to some of the takeaway, because I think for people who know Columbia, they think of it as a success because it is a strong community, high income, good education, always ranked like one of the best places to live or one of the safest places to live, what have you. And unlike, I think we at NCRC that focus so much around the Community Reinvestment Act and the history of segregation and gentrification and these types of things, that it's unusual to have a community that was designed to be racially integrated, meaning Black and white, that had an understanding of class integration. Most of the time, we're looking at communities that were designed to be segregated. And then the question is, how do you overcome that? And so we wanted to look at a place that was designed to be more integrated. And then, what has happened 55 years later, and again, I think we're seeing that for a host of reasons, that the kind of Columbia being at the forefront and leading the area in integration is no longer the case. And it's a mixture of not as much intentionality in mixed housing, whether it's racial or economic, as well as catching up of society as a whole is less intentionally racially segregated. So it's kind of society's come up and Columbia's kind of slowed down. So it makes Columbia still ahead, but just not nearly as ahead as it used to be. And I think one of the greatest issues, and this is issues in general, the unaffordability of housing has always been a huge issue and has been growing in this country in 40 years. And I think it's a ongoing crisis here in Columbia.
Yeah. And so, as you stated, sort of at least 2 of the major takeaways of the study are kind of contained in the title of the study itself, of increasing segregation and a lack of affordable housing in Columbia. And so were those 2 trends, is that kind of what you were expecting going into doing this study, or did you find, the results and the data that the study produced to be surprising, or is it kind of confirm what you were already expecting? And were there any surprising takeaways for you from the study?
Yeah, there were some surprising takeaways. And I did, think that there wasn't going to be an issue of a lack of affordable housing. There's a feeling that Columbia, and, I think just as a person who lived here, it's that Columbia used to be affordable. And then as time went on, it became more and more unaffordable. And I hear many people of my generation, and even younger, say, they can't afford to live in Columbia, though they grew up here. So I expected that. I was surprised by some kind of small things on the side. Like I didn't realize that I don't think any of Columbia high schools, that doesn't include Glen Elg, I don't know the stats for Mount Hebron, but that any of them are majority white. That's really interesting to me. Like, because as someone who grew up here, all of the schools were majority white. You know, people considered Oakland Mills Rowan a black school because it was 25, maybe 30% black, but it was still majority white, right? So that's interesting to me. Not as surprising, though I didn't know this. I did think it was interesting how the report highlighted that half of Columbia schools are over 50% Black and Latino, and then you could take the other half and see that they're majority white and Asian. So I think, you know, that is interesting how that is developing, and how much, and usually, not always, but usually the older schools are the one that are majority Black and Latino, and the newer schools, the newer neighborhoods are not always, though, are more likely to be a majority white and Asian American. And that kind of goes with as Columbia over time, you started seeing less and less mix of single family homes, rentals, and townhomes, and just started seeing like River Hill being the example of mostly, you know, overwhelmingly single family homes, average value $700,000 a year, right? So that, and, you know, I think that's an important piece, that economic division. And I say this actually, you know, I've always been doing racial inequality work. The big line I always use is the foundation of racial inequality is racial economic inequality. And the foundation of racial economic inequality is the racial wealth divide. So, and home ownership is such a huge part of wealth in society. So when you have areas that are increasingly $700,000 median value of a home, that will perpetuate, maintain racial inequality, economic inequality. And just one other thing I'll put out before you ask me some more questions is, one thing I was surprised about, I didn't quite understand, is that Columbia never was really affordable. Now, and you can use affordable in different contexts. The report uses the technical thing of affordable, which I think is kind of weird, where it's affordable if the housing costs are close to the median income. But that also can mean a place with a very high income, like Columbia, can have affordable housing, even though most Americans couldn't afford to live there, right? So when I'm saying affordable, is the report does look at what the median housing value was in 1970 nationwide, and what the median value in Columbia was. And I was surprised to see that Columbia had, and it makes sense, it was a new area, so there's a whole different factors, right? Most of Columbia 1970 were new homes, so of course they should be more expensive than places where homes might be 30, 40 years old, right? So there's a whole host of factors, but that Columbia was really never that affordable relative to the average national income for people to buy homes. And even though it might have had a good mix of single family townhomes and rentals, there really wasn't much in terms of low income rentals in the early days of Columbia. I think as the way we've approached affordable rent or low income rentals has changed, where it's not so much you create a low income housing building, but you have I don't know why I'm blanking on the phrase, but you get a subsidy that you can use for rent out a townhome or rent out an apartment, so that people can then use those in any of the townhomes or apartments. And so that, I think, has actually allowed more low income people in, but that doesn't usually happen for a big single family home, right? And so that's how places like River Hill can kind of, you know, make sure that there's no low income people, there's not really median income people, there's only very, very high income.
Yes. So I think it's good that the distinction that affordability in Columbia or in Howard County does not necessarily translate into, you know, their affordability. That term is relative, and I would say the county, those who talk, you know, who discuss affordable housing, whether it's the county council and so on and so forth, there's always this debate about what does affordability mean in Howard County. So I think that's important to touch on. And I was going to ask you about, would you agree that race is still a proxy for income, and it sounds like, based on your response, that would be. I feel like we would agree with that. I think in terms of like an established sort of fact, but you're more than welcome to add to more nuance to that. But my main question is a takeaway that I got from reading this is when Rouse built Howard or Columbia, he was intentional in providing an integrated community, and that's income, race, and so on and so forth. As time went by, that intentionality has sort of disappeared, and now we have Riverhill, Dorsey, or what have you, where they're more higher income and by proxy perhaps wider, although different other races as well, but perhaps wider communities, and then lower income, perhaps more minority groups in Colombia. So that was what happened. My takeaway was that the reason that those segregated communities occurred was due to for lack of a more broader term, due to racism, right? So you had, like you said, people could because they were building, because there were more single family homes, they could reduce the ability or eliminate the ability of people with vouchers or things like that to be able to rent in those communities. Would you say that that's sort of what happened, or I don't want to provide like leading. But,
so and let me also add one more thing or two more things that surprised me about the report, kind of related to the race as I forget how you phrase it, but like race kind of equaling income or what have you. But one other thing I was surprised about was I thought the Black population would have stopped increasing around 2000 or something like that, just as Colombia becomes more and more unaffordable. I just would have assumed that would have slowed down, maybe even stopped the growth in the Black population. It was interesting for me to see that the Black population has continued to increase, whether in total number or even percentage of Colombia, up into 2020, right? And I don't have data past 2020. So that was interesting to me. And what was also interesting to me was that the white population in total number, not even in percentage, but in total number, is decreasing in Colombia. And so that was, that I didn't necessarily expect that. So Colombia is growing, but actually overall, the white population isn't growing. It's actually decreasing, and it's growing through Black, Latino, Asian American. So those things were interesting. I don't, race and income, there's definitely some correlations there. But one of the things I do when focusing on the racial wealth divide is I highlight how I think wealth is even stronger, right? Because you have a decent amount of, Blacks who even make the same income as whites have radically lower levels of wealth, which means then they also oftentimes can only afford substantially lower priced housing. And that really reinforces housing segregation, right? So that's a distinction there. That's why I focused the last 20 years on this idea of the racial wealth divide. And then you were getting into questions about, maybe why there is this increasing segregation. One thing I'll put forward is that I think Colombia was so successful in that first people came to Colombia for a mission, right? They came to Colombia to be part of a new community. they came to Columbia to be part of an integrated community. And that was kind of a thing that idealists might do. So you had different types of, and people who were much more open to, usually if they were more open to living with Black people, they're also more open to living with mixed income people. And they wanted that type of diversity in the school. But as Columbia just started becoming, top 5 best place to live, right? Top 5 best school systems, you had people who just want to come here to be part of an elite suburb, right? And so they don't have the same type of desire to, and they're probably not outright racist. Like if a Black kid's at the school, fine, but as long as my school is the best school, I don't care, right? But it's a very different types of populations that allow for kind of a different type of diversity. So I think that's happened over time. And then there's always the challenge of, and how far can you have a progressive community that's doing something different than the nation when your community is just part of a larger economic frame? And I'll put forward too, I do think Columbia was able to be as successful as it was because it was so dominated by, and this is weird, by the Rouse Corporation. So it wasn't just free market, because we just have free market, you're going to have housing segregation. Like it just kind of goes with that, right? And you just have, developers always want to have the highest profit margin. So they always want to build the most expensive houses. So it's really as, Rouse Corporation, what have you, lost power to intentionally put rentals, even though they weren't putting low income housing, still rentals and townhomes. And they weren't always needing to feel the need to make the most money possible. They just wanted to make money. You start having the free market and they want to make the most money possible. They're not even happy with just making a profit. So I think all of those things has helped, moved Columbia away from its imperfect path in the beginning. Because again, I do think a strong critique of Columbia was that it was never really designed for low income populations. And if we really want to have a community that reflects society as a whole, there should be low income people, median income people, and high income people all going to good schools and living together. And I think Columbia's always fallen short of that.
Yeah, no, and sort of on that topic, I wanted to ask, as you just mentioned now, and as your study sort of touched on, a big reason of the increasing segregation and lack of affordable housing has been the drastic change in village design of some of the newer villages like River Hill compared to some of the original villages when Rouse first built Columbia. And I think a common and popular and very intuitive and easy to understand narrative that certainly I really bought into for a long time, but have more recently started to question a little bit, is that Jim Rouse did come along and have this really noble vision for a racially and socioeconomically integrated town in Columbia, and he started to do that with the original villages. And then Jim Rouse died, and then the Rouse Company got sold off to Howard Hughes Corporation, headquartered in Texas, which is named after a literal billionaire who is a very good sort of figurehead for capitalism, unregulated capitalism. And so I think a very easy narrative to buy into is that that explains sort of the change in village design, or the shift towards even less low income housing than before.
And again, I wouldn't say low income housing. I might say more moderate income housing. Yeah, because again, Columbia's not been big in low income housing ever.
Yeah.
It actually, I think, has more quote unquote low income people living in Columbia now than they did earlier on. I just saw, we had numbers, how the poverty rate in Columbia has increased from 2000 to 2020, right? Which I don't think is a bad thing, in that it was 5% of the population. I think it got to about 7 or 8% in 2020. And nationally, the poverty rate's like 12%, right? And so I do think, we would want to have people, and, and for a brief period, my family was in that, poverty situation. And it was and actually, I think that's the thing that people get the most wrong, is people who actually are living very well and have 2 professional parents making good money think their kid has to go to the absolute best school. But actually, most studies show that doesn't really have a radical effect on your kids. Your kids are doing pretty well. It's really the most low income kids where it's most important for them to go to a strong public school, because that is where they're getting a lot more resources than they have at home. But there's so much focus on making sure the most elite kids go to the most elite schools, instead of saying, hey, we really want to help society and help everybody. We should focus more on what can be most helpful for the most low-income kids and bring them in. But anyway.
Absolutely. And, another piece of that problem of, the disparities in school quality or perceived school quality is, why are there such drastic disparities in schools in the first place? If you really have an equitable, diverse in all ways, segregated community, then in my opinion, you should also to some degree see that reflected in the schools. And so to have these, disparities in schools, to me, is also reflective of the disparities in the communities themselves, because school districts are based off of the neighborhoods and communities that people live in. And so I think, increasing school segregation and increasing housing segregation often go hand in hand with one another. But to get
just real quick on the school space too, I also want to note the idea of what is a strong school and a weak school, I think, is also totally off, because it's kind of just a school that has the most kids with the highest GPA, not even so much highest GPAs, but like the most AP classes and stuff like that. Really, what that's just telling you is this is the school that has the highest income kids, the most wealthy kids. That's really all it's saying, right? If you really want to compare like school quality, then what you could look at, all right, so compare kids who get subsidized lunches in one school, and then compare kids of subsidized lunches in another school, and how are they doing? And like compare people in similar income economic situations. But what we do is, River Hill, they have the highest graduation rates, they're doing the highest in standardized tests, so that's the best school, so you need to go there to get a higher standardized test. But no, it's just kids who are best situated to do well go there and are kept there. And then we act like the school's doing something magical. Now, I'm not saying that there's not some schools that have more things than others, what have you, but I'm just saying the way we generally grade schools is just telling us, oh, the richest and usually whitest, and in Columbia's situation, oftentimes Asian American, that's most concentrated there. And so somehow that's the best school, and everybody, and it just reinforces that. So I think, we really, if we really cared about what schools are doing well, we'd have a much more sophisticated way of comparing schools and how students are doing based on their socioeconomic space, and then how they do educationally.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you say, sort of the best indicator and predictor of if a student is going to go well is not even what school they go to, but the income of the household that they come from. And so when you have a school like River Hill, doing disproportionately well, which I don't even know if that is the case, because I haven't actually looked at the numbers, but if that is the case, then it's most likely because, because the villages or that village in particular was designed in a segregated way, not just racially, but especially in terms of higher income levels. That's the greater explanation for why, the outcomes with that school are the way that they are. So again, that's why I say the segregated schools, or the disparities in grades at schools, or whatever indicator you're using, are often a result of the segregated communities themselves. But to that original question I was asking of, do you think it was a matter of, Columbia got thrown off its path when Jim Rouse died, and then his company got sold off to the greedy Howard Hughes Corporation, or as I've talked to more people, should we maybe be a little bit more cynical about what Jim Rouse's original intentions were in the first place? And maybe originally he did, market it as this racially integrated place because even if it wasn't popular per se in the country at the time, he could probably see that there would be a market for it, and it seemed like it was catered towards still upper income people. And so some people might say, no, Columbia is not broken. Columbia is actually just reaching the end point of kind of its original design, or is maybe the truth somewhere more in between those two kind of polar opposites or different narratives?
Yeah, I'll note I need to study more Columbia and the original documents, but what was interesting to me was actually a lot of the writings I saw didn't really talk a lot about racial integration. Right, like it actually is not, talking about welcoming African. And again, this was 69, right? King was just killed in 68. Like, so it, and because I think too, we got to look back about what was radically inclusive in 69. And what was radically inclusive was just not having neighborhoods that said Black people couldn't live there. You know what I mean? Like that was radically, because like, again, the opening documents were like, we're going to be a racially inclusive society, whatever the language is, right? This is going to be a society where Blacks and whites can really come together and live. That wasn't in the documents, right? It was much more, we're going to have, I think they might have said inclusive, right? Maybe I'm adding more, but something broad like that. But also, what's clear, it was going to be profitable, right? Like that was clear in the original space, which I think shows the limits of, and I don't look at this cynically. I just think we should look at development models and see Columbia is looked at as a great example of success. And it is successful in many ways, but I think it shows the limit of the profit-driven model of what it can do. I think maybe at its strongest, it can create a strong community that's higher than the national median income and make it pretty inclusive of different racial groups, but not very inclusive of low-income groups, right? That was one other interesting thing I saw with the African-American population in Columbia. It's interesting that before 2000, African-Americans generally made less money than the national income, right? And came, which makes sense because nationwide Blacks have less income than, but after I think 2000 or 2010, I guess it started in 2010, the African-American population in Columbia median income is higher than the national median income, right? And so I think it first was a space where Blacks who, again, they weren't poor, but they just, were a little bit below national median income. But then over time, it's now become a place of where even more high income African-Americans are coming in. But also like to say this, the high income African-Americans, I think it was like $90,000 median income, which is a lot of money, but also it's not that much, right? So that's for a household, right? So that could be two people making 45,000. Right. So it's not like, only Black millionaires are coming to Columbia or even Blacks making over 300,000. Right. It's the median income is not. And I think a lot of people don't understand how little most Americans make, period. Right. And that the median household income for Blacks, I think, is like 47,000. So that's household 47. For whites, it's like 70. So substantially more, but it's still not a lot of money. That's two people making 35. Right. And that is one challenge, I think, with Columbia, is that we can be so far removed from those realities.
Yeah.
Sorry, and just one other thing. Columbia is a high income area. Howard County is a higher income area. And then Maryland is one of the most high income states in the country, which people don't think about. Because again, it might even only be maybe median income in Maryland, maybe 90, 100,000. So it could be two people making 50, but still, most of the other countries not making that type of money, so.
Yeah, no, those are good points there, Dedrick. I was kind of struggling earlier to ask my question about intentionality, and wanted to go back to that. So, when we talk about Rouse, and the research talks about this, that he was intentional in integrating Columbia and so on and so forth. My takeaway was, as time went by, that intentionality disappeared. At the same time, whereas Rouse was, as a developer, was very hands-on in the way Columbia was shaped. As time went by, the newer developers, and the developers who were there at that time, including Howard Hughes, that came after, was more incidental to what happened, to the final makeup.
I think you might be being even more nice by saying incidental. In that, and I'm not going to be so critical to say that they were against it. I don't mean that. I just mean that they weren't focused on that at all. They were focused on how can I make the most money possible off this now, because now too, it's not like, oh, will people come to a formerly rural place to create a nice suburb? It's like, this is one of the nicest suburbs in the country. We're creating an exurb for Howard County, or kind of even River Hill, in many ways, is a suburb of Columbia. Even though it's supposed to be in Columbia, it really is kind of a suburb of Columbia. So now we're going to make a suburb of one of the nicest suburbs, right? And so we can even make more money there. So I think it was just much more, I think Rouse showed maybe the strongest you can do with a profit motive, and have some other motives. And then, other developments is just profit, just profit,
right,
dropping pretense of other larger social visions, right? Which,
yeah.
and I think again, that goes to people to understand the depth of racial and economic inequality. It's only dismantled with deep intention over long periods of time. If that's not the forethought, if that's not the foremost of what you're doing, then I guarantee you will go back into racial economic segregation, because that is the way of the economy, of economic forces. Well, of economic forces in a society that has been developed through economic inequality. It'll keep going that direction until there's like 40, 50-year period of deep investment to change that. And then if you had a completely, equitable society, then there's not a reason why the market would drive to racial inequality. It just might just go to economic inequality, right? Because you can still have economic inequality without racial inequality, but it's still so central to the US. Without that deep intention, you just go back into historical racial segregation.
Right, and that's why I want us in this podcast and going forward to continue talking about is that, and they talk about, and you talk about this in the write-up, in the research, in that, there was the 2019 redistricting, and I remember that 2019 redistricting, it became very vicious. And one thing, a lot of the establishment Democrats in Howard County and the pro-developer lobby talked about is, you have these communities like River Hill and, of course, Western Howard County, and those people are racist, and that's why we have the segregated communities that we have. And basically, a lot of the responsibility and attribution for why these things happened sort of became muddled, and I felt like the developers and the county planners, the county zoning and land use planners, came out of it, clean, unfortunately. And so, that's why I was saying, it's the, I was hoping to bring that forth, and get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, because I think I think there is a false assumption about racism. People have tried to make racism so much about personal prejudice, and I do this in my racial wealth divide presentations. Like, I say the foundation of racial inequality is racial economic inequality, right? I don't think, like Europeans didn't just hate Black Africans, right? Like they wanted labor. And so they took them, and then that created deep tensions. And then you had to justify why you're treating human beings in such a horrific way. So you make them less than human, right? It wasn't just they had bad relations, or like Western Europeans in the United States just didn't get along well with Native Americans. You don't get along well when you take in someone's land, and you get along well, maybe equally as bad when you're taking them, right? So it was like material desires that were kind of at the center, not just like, oh, I'm just somehow born a racist person and I hate people of different skin colors, right? So I think people confuse that, right? And so people think, oh, I have a Black friend, or I have a Latino friend, or I have what have you. I don't hate people by their race. But at the same time, they're almost ready to riot if you start bringing in lower income kids to their schools. And like, the problem is, I'm not concerned about your personal prejudice. I'm concerned about whether you are reinforcing racial inequality. And you might be doing it because you think that's good for your kid. Wherever you're doing it, and that's how we need to challenge people on that.
No, I don't disagree with people's tendencies to collectively push back on low-income housing, for example, right?
I think I do, but go ahead. I'll let you keep going.
No, well, I guess what I mean is that people have done that. People do that. When there's a low-income housing, people, I think, there's documented, incidents in history where people have used other reasons to push back against that. What I'm trying to until now, though, the only narrative has been that. The only narrative has been that people have collectively resisted and pushed back. In Howard County, when you look at Maple Lawn and River Hill, Wild Lake Village Center, downtown Columbia, there were active zoning and land use decisions by people who considered themselves pro-equity, pro-racial diversity, who took action to restrict low-income housing from going there, right? These were county leaders. And the part that's missing in Howard County. Mm-hmm.
I want to highlight, that's not unusual. I mean, it's not unusual. When Martin Luther King went north with the civil rights movement, the same people that supported him when he was desegregating the South opposed him when he tried to integrate the schools in the North. It's like people think they're racially inclusive and equitable, but when it starts talking about, well, now you're going to do things in my neighborhood that might bring in, and they'll reframe it. It's not that I'm against Black people. It's just I don't want troublemakers. I don't want low income. I don't want, whatever it is. But I mean, that's the story. That's why it's so hard, because we have to really do serious social change that goes across class lines and with people's false narrative that the only way my kid can do great is if my kid goes to school with like no poor kids. And it's just like, your kid's gonna be great either way.
I agree with that. Just one more point on this, Jake. I still think, though, Dedrick, when you're talking about, the people you're describing are the individuals who live there, right? And I don't disagree that some of them do that. I'm talking about, especially in Howard County, and I'm a fan of, naming people who are doing this. I'm talking about, the county executive, Calvin Ball, who's been a county executive for, who's been, in office for almost 20 years. Other council members, Ken Allman. These are the people who are in charge when places like Maple Lawn were built, and Vernon Gray. Like, these are the people who are in charge, and they took votes to create those communities. And after it happened, they might say, well, it's because of individuals who opposed it, but they did take those votes, and they somehow the narrative is, I feel like, exculpatory to them. And that's why I wanted to bring that into focus.
Yeah, and honestly, I don't know local politics well enough and haven't focused enough, even in this report, to highlight like, was it this company that did this or this politician that was particularly, I mean, because I think generally we haven't seen strong leadership in further diversifying Colombia economically, and definitely making sure that new villages just even reflect what Rouse was doing in the beginning, which wasn't really many low income. It was just allowing for moderate income people to be there. And we don't even see that, right? So everyone has failed in that because it hasn't happened, right? So yeah, because that's all I can say on that, because I haven't studied that in detail. I can't point. I'm sure you can, and you're pointing out people, but I can't, because I don't know. I used to know Vernon Grant. Vernon used to, I thought, advocate for lower income housing in different places. But again, this was like the 80s or 90s. I have no idea the last 30 years.
Yeah, I'm try to wrap this up here, close it out with one last question and a comment on, I think, Dedrick, what, you're talking about with in terms of the homeowners, whether they realize it or not, even if they just have the intention of, I just want my kids going to the best schools or not, that could unintentionally reinforce, racist systems or, systems that segregate people, and that we shouldn't just ignore that, even if that's not their intention, because it still does have that effect. But I think, Huri's point is that when we talk about these things like River Hill being, much more upper income, single family homes, and how that, because of that design, naturally, whether the intention was that or not, will lead to racial segregation on a long enough timeline. I think the point is that for that to happen, for River Hill to be zoned that way or designed that way, and the reason why Jim Rouse even needed to make a presentation to the county council in the first place is because developers, although we often sometimes talk about them in this way, they're not these all-powerful forces that can just do whatever they want. They still have to follow county laws. So anything a developer wants to do, whether that be, planning River Hill and upper income, they need the county council's approval to do so. And I think, that needs to be taken into consideration, that these upper income, wealthy white homeowners couldn't have moved into these segregated communities if the segregated communities were not allowed to be zoned that way in the first place by the county council, by the local government.
No. And I do think there's more responsibility on those who designed elite neighborhoods that don't allow, a mixed income, mixed race, or let's say racial groups that have historically been disenfranchised. The design is more important than the individual will, right? The individual will reinforces it, right? And like, I don't want to live in the most racially exclusive communities or the most economically elite communities. I generally don't want my kids at those schools, right? But the way you're going to get change is not just by a whole bunch of individuals having this, I'm going to buck the system, is you got to change the system, right? And you're right. And that is what, and I think, and I think that's been a challenge, is that I'm not even saying because the Rouse company were such good guys and stuff, but as you lost control and just open it up to the market, and government wasn't willing to come in and say, and we're going to really keep that vision going, which requires great intentionality and great strength, then you're deciding we're not doing that. And we're going to have elite neighborhoods and really throw away what we celebrate about Colombia so much.
Absolutely. And last question, you can also, wrap it up, give, social media or any plugs you want to give. But, you did, this study came out publicly on February 1st, as part of Black History Month. So real quick, why are these issues? I mean, increasing segregation kind of speaks for itself, but lack of affordable housing, like why, in your opinion, should that be seen as a racial justice issue or as a Black issue?
Well, and again, I was putting this paper too. Only some people can I want to highlight this paper was particularly focused on the African American community, right? There are many more papers that should be developed. It would be interesting to look at the fastest growing communities, Asian American, Latinos in the not in the U.S., in Columbia, Maryland, and how their growth has affected and what type of segregation. So there's so many things. Someone have brought up too, even Columbia and Howard County, like how has development occurred for Howard County that hasn't had to follow the rules of Columbia the last 55 years. So there's so many different spaces, but we knew in a 20-page report, you can't do everything. I think we did a lot. And I will say, I think, no matter if you like where I'm taking the data, there's a lot of good data in here that have interactive graphics that I think could be helpful for people to make up their own mind about what they've seen in Columbia, what's been happening. So I do recommend looking at it online because you can get more specific information. But, your question about, kind of why, as someone who cares so much about African-American issues, so focused on race and economics, let's go back again. I worked in multicultural centers. I did some organizing in Harlem, did civil rights work, and I kept seeing economics at the center of all this, right? And it really led me to this again. Foundation of racial inequalities, racial economic inequality. The foundation of racial economic inequality is the racial wealth divide. Without changing, and wealth is assets, not just your balance sheet, but part of your wealth is a safe neighborhood, good public schools, public transportation, which is something that Columbia has always been pretty poor at, right? Good healthcare. So Columbia was positive and had a lot of good, strong public assets because it needs to be public assets. Because if it's just private assets, only the wealthy will have it. So I love the path system in Columbia. I love these things where you can, kind of go out and kind of have a park as part of where you live. So those are good things, but we need to reinforce and double down on that. And you even see, and that's one of the reasons I don't even like a lot of the newer neighborhoods. They don't even have that. Like they don't have good public spaces, right? They have a very nice, expensive home with some lawn, and that's it. I love old Columbia where you can go back behind the house and there's a path system that you can take for 10, 20 miles. They go all across Columbia. So I think there's some positive things to learn at Columbia that we need to double down in and then can be used as models for different parts around the country. But we really do need strong public assets investing in people that we make sure is inclusive. And Columbia is on the wrong path of that right now.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Dedrick. This has been episode 24 of the Progressive Democrats of Howard County podcast. If you would like to subscribe to our email list, follow us on social media, become a dues paying member, et cetera, et cetera. Check us out on linktr.ee/HOCO progressives. You can find all of those links and more. Other than that, thank you for tuning in, and we will see you all for episode 25. Take care.